A Buddha's Enlightenment by Venerable Rungruan Papasaro, Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Patapa. In Mahasakjaka Sutta, the Buddha exemplified on how a person will get an enlightenment like a piece of wood that can be used for burning or not. That is, a person who live bodily withdrawn from sensual pleasures, and whose sensual desire, affection, infatuation, thirst, and fever for sensual pleasures has been fully abandoned and suppressed internally, then the person is not yet capable of knowledge and vision and supreme enlightenment. It should be noticed that the Buddha introduced the three similes outlined as a framework to attain knowledge and vision and supreme enlightenment in the threefold study strategy. Starting with a person with morality is compared like a piece of wood, but the household life is crowded and dusty like the wood that is wetted by being in water. Therefore the person has to go forth from the home life into homelessness, and study on the mind to abandon the rough defilements of greed, hatred, and delusion rightly, and then abandoning the middle defilements of five lower fetters rightly. However, this will be compared like a wet sappy piece of wood, even though it is lying on dry land far from water. And finally, in order to make a dry sappy piece of wood, we have to perform an insight observation for wisdom development for the destruction of the taints with the cessations of craving, cling, and ignorance within the process of dependent origination. The Buddha understood that the morality will only stop to take any unwholesome action to the world, and then we have to make a further study into the mind in order to understand how the mind function, and causing any dysfunction of unwholesomeness, and then learning the Dharma to cleanse all kinds of problems inside the mind. And finally performing an insight observation to see the mind processing in the process of dependent origination to gain wisdom for the destruction of the taints, so that the mind will be completely purified and liberated, and this the Buddhist way to make an end of suffering in life. What was the most critical factor for the beginning of the Buddhist practice began when the Buddha recalled while he was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states. Then he entered and dwelled in the first jhana, which was accompanied by thought and examination, with rapture and happiness born of seclusion. The Buddha explained that he took several experiments trying to figure out the path to enlightenment, and he finally discovered that by having mindfulness in the absorption is the answer. That is, this, establishing mindfulness through an absorption, is indeed the path to enlightenment. Then the Buddha proceeded in the mindfulness absorption until dwelling equanimity, and mindful and clearly comprehending, and then the mind was thus concentrated, purified, bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability, then leading to the great knowledge of enlightenment. The Buddha applied a wisdom approach to an enlightenment by incorporating the establishing of mindfulness to abandon all the unwholesome thoughts, and then performing an insight observation to gain wisdom. These two, knowledge of the recollection of past lives and the knowledge of the passing away and rebirth of beings, lead to a conclusion of the law of cause and effect, so-called idhapakayata, that a life is a natural process of the process of dependent origination. Generally, there are two interpretations on these knowledge in terms of past lives, the passing away and rebirth of beings. The first one is the broad perspective view of a life to live within a cycle of life, and the past lives means the past lives of the time span of living of a being in several years. However, since there are very few people can develop this capability. Therefore, this leads to an alternative interpretation of the narrow perspective view of a life of the object of consciousness that arises and fades away within a short time. The knowledge of the recollection of past lives is the ability to retrieve all the past data of what happening in life, and once having a sufficient information, then by performing the functional analysis of each particular incident and the structural analysis of the whole system, then the Buddha clearly understand the cause and effect of what is happening in life, and this is the knowledge of the passing away and rebirth of beings. The main highlight of the Buddha's enlightenment is the true knowledge for destruction of taints, which is a kind of knowledge derived from the two previous knowledge of the process of dependent origination, and the cause and effect of what is happening in each state of mind. Putting into simple terms, the Buddha sees the Dharma of the process of dependent origination, and then by applying the Four Noble Truths analysis on these collected data of phenomena, then knowing the certain mind condition when the taint arises, then understanding where about the origin of taint within the process of dependent origination. For examples, the taint on sensual desire is originated at craving, the taint on existence is originated at clinging, and the taint on ignorance is originated at ignorance, respectively. Then having a knowledge for the destruction of the taints by a proper dharma, for examples the dharma of disenchantment for the destruction of taint on sensual desire, the dharma of releasing the object of consciousness for the destruction of taint on existence, and the dharma of the Four Noble Truths for the destruction of the taint on ignorance. And then by completely destruct all the taints inside the mind, thus the mind is purified, and the mind is liberated. This is the way to make an end of suffering in life. In principle, the special unique part of Buddhist practice is an inside observation to see the dharma of the nature, that is, to see the mind conditions, and then extending the observation to see the mind processing to gain the knowledge of the truths of life within nature. This is the greatest journey to make a good understanding on the truths of life within nature, and once realizing that a life is no self, but simply a natural processing through the path of life evolution.